This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 970 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. I do this series of episodes each year where I go through some of my favorite buy and sell candidates in Dynasty. Buy candidates being players you might want to consider trading for, and sell candidates being players you might want to trade away. It's pretty straightforward. Now, as usual, my goal isn't just hand you a list of guys and just say, hey, go trade for these guys. I want to explain the why. I also don't think about my trades strictly from that kind of perspective. I've talked about this for years and years now, but getting a deal done in fantasy football involves looking at your trade partner and filling their needs with something that you have. It's not about having this really small consideration set of 7 or 8 players and saying, I won't trade unless it's for this particular guy. You'll never get a trade done that way. Nevertheless, I wanted to at least share a handful of players that I'll be scoping out in my leagues over the next handful of months. And since this is a buy candidates episode, a lot of these players, they're on the cheaper side. It's not that I'm against trading for a big name player, quite the opposite. It's just that if I'm trying to call out players who are most accessible for you to trade for, those guys are naturally going to be on the cheaper side. So some of the players on today's list, they are in dart throw territory. But often, those players can be the difference in winning and losing in Dynasty. Anyway, enough with my rambling. We'll get to those buy candidates in just a second. First, the big game is this weekend, and Underdog has you covered. Underdog is celebrating the big game by giving everyone a no-sweat entry, which means you either cash in or you get your entry fee back in bonus credit. Join Underdog before the big game kicks off on Sunday by signing up with promo code LATEROUND to get up to $1,000 in bonus cash when you make your first deposit. And you get a free pick. And you get the no-sweat entry. Check it all out today, UnderdogFantasy.com. Also, remember that the Late Round Prospect Guide is available for pre-order. There's some cool enhancements that I'm making to the guide this year, but aside from those, you get profiles of every running back and wide receiver who are going to be at the combine. You get year 2 profiles of all relevant NFL sophomores. You get to know what goes into these models and so much more. Head to lateround.com right now and pre-order the guide for $14.99. When it launches on March 10th, that price will jump up by $5. And yes, you get an updated version of that guide within 24 hours of the NFL draft ending. I usually have that updated version out the night of the final day of the draft. Again, that's lateround.com. Pre-order the prospect guide and make sure it's the 2025 prospect guide today. So the way I went about this was that I looked at my dynasty rankings, which I did update for February, and I compared those rankings to what we see over at keeptradecut.com. It's not perfect, but it at least tells me some players who I'm higher or lower on versus the market. And then from there, I chose a handful to talk about today. Now, I'm going to jump around from player to player on this episode, so the guys that I mention, they're in no particular order, just for the record. We'll kick things off with probably the least surprising player on this list, Jalen Waddle. The sentiment around Waddle, it's naturally pretty negative. He had a bad year. He was one of the worst picks at ADP this past year in redraft. And he can't ever seem to stay healthy. That's all driving his price down in my eyes. But I said it before, I'll say it again. Waddle is a very talented wide receiver. And it's not like he hasn't shown up in fantasy football. Prior to 2024, Waddle had back-to-back seasons with the yards per route run rate above 2.5. He was an elite prospect who had a really, really good rookie year. That led to a strong year 2 score. Now, the year 2 model, for anyone who's unaware, it's a model of mine that looks at a player's prospect score and his rookie season numbers to try and predict how well he's going to perform in year 2 and year 3 of his NFL career. Now, I talked about Waddle on my Things I Got Wrong episode a couple of weeks back. And on that show, I mentioned how the Dolphins switch up their offense and force more looks to both Jonnu Smith and Devon Achane. Waddle wasn't the one who benefited from Tua Tagovailoa's lower average depth of target this past year. But when Waddle and Tua were both healthy together, his PPR points per game, it was close to 13. It's not fantastic, but it's not nearly as bad as the 10 PPR points that he actually averaged per game. And that's after 3 years of 15.4, 15.3, and 14.2 PPR points per game. No one should be selling Waddle as a cornerstone piece in Dynasty, but he's had a really underrated start to his career. I'm not going to let this past season completely derail things, which is why I'm a few wide receiver spots ahead of the market with Jalen Waddle. I expect a bounce back in 2025, just given what we've seen from him through the first 4 years of his career. And that could look even better and be even easier if there's some unforeseen movement with Tyreek Hill, which doesn't seem out of the question right now. There's kind of a similar story for Chris Olave. I'm also higher on Olave versus the market right now. Olave's had good peripherals to start his NFL career. Maybe he's not an alpha, but he's a really good wide receiver. He just had trouble staying healthy in 2024, and let's be honest, guys, situationally, he hasn't been in the best spot in the world. I think those factors make him a more volatile pick on today's show than someone like Jalen Waddle. Olave has a concussion problem. That can obviously go south. That's risky. We should probably also feel better about Jalen Waddle's short-term potential than Chris Olave's, just given the situation. But I'm in the business of trying to accumulate talent in Dynasty. And to me, Chris Olave, very talented wide receiver. Did you know that Olave's never finished a season with a yards per route run rate below 2? Yards per route run is a pretty predictive metric. It's obviously not everything. I like to pair it up with like points per game to get a more comprehensive look at how good or bad a player was in a given year. I like to use the metric a lot, but of course it's not flawless. No metric is. But get this, over his first 3 years, Olave's had yards per route run rates, according to PFF data, of 2.42, 2.07, and 2.13. Some of you may have no idea what that means, but typically anything above 2 is a really strong yards per route run rate. And get this, among wide receivers who started their NFL career in 2011 onward, there's been just 13 to hit a yards per route run rate of 2.0 in each of their first 3 seasons. And that's with a minimum 100 routes run each season. One of them is Chris Olave, like I just said. The others, though, are Randall Cobb, AJ Green, Julio Jones, Mike Evans, Odell Beckham, Tyreek Hill, Michael Thomas, Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase. Olave's prospect score was excellent. His year 2 score was excellent. He maybe hasn't given us a huge season yet. He's basically been like a low-end wide receiver 2 at best. But to me, the potential is still there. And I don't think the risk is that insane when the market is pricing him at wide receiver 23. But there is some risk given those concussions and given his situation in New Orleans. Some of you may not want to take that on, which is understandable. I'm just willing to. I always have a hard time with quarterbacks when it comes to these lists, because to me, the market does a pretty good job of properly valuing the position. The one player I seem to be highest on versus the market right now, though, is Dak Prescott. It's only a 2-spot positional difference, but it's enough to call it out to give you guys a little variety on today's show. There's no doubt that Dak's 2024 was weaker than what we'd seen him provide in the season prior. And then he got hurt, so there wasn't even an opportunity for a bounce back. I just don't think it's necessary to take the 2024 season and assume that's what he is now. He finished with his lowest completion percentage of his career. His yards per attempt was second lowest. And then his touchdown rate, that was lowest too. And that's a number that typically does regress. That's all while having an average depth of target that was more or less in line with what we've seen in recent history from Dak Prescott. Now, maybe people are turned off by this Brian Schottenheimer hire. I think there's some validity to that. But if it makes you feel any better, and hopefully it does, Schottenheimer was also Dallas's offensive coordinator in 2023 when Dak averaged over 20 standard fantasy points per game. Now, granted, Mike McCarthy did a lot of that play calling, but it's still not nothing. And I'm by no means a Schottenheimer stan, but during his time in Seattle, which came before Dallas, the Seahawks offenses ranked 6th, 7th, and 6th in offensive touchdowns per game. Regardless of personnel, that's pretty solid. Now, I know it's easy to talk junk about that hire. I'm with you. I don't think it was a good hire. I just don't think it's necessary to automatically take it in the other direction, at least as it pertains to fantasy football. There was a great rookie quarterback class that came out last year, but getting Dak Prescott past QB 20 right now, comfortably past that point, that feels like a really good idea. he could still have a handful of strong years left in the tank. The scary part about running backs and trading for them this time of year is that we're looking at a pretty good running back class. Actually, a really good running back class. So if there's any fragile piece to a current running back's profile, there's a chance that we see that running back get ruined by the NFL draft. This, to me, is a reason the Steelers could be done with Najee Harris, more officially. He's a free agent, but there's always a chance the Steelers just re-sign him. I think they'd want to see what they can do in the NFL draft, though, before they would want to do that, all while getting Jaylen Warren back, who's currently a restricted free agent. And that leads me to Jaylen Warren. He's the kind of player who can help fantasy teams out on limited touches. His highest rush share per game rate during his 3-year career is just 30.6%. But the pass catching, that's what gets us. Despite having more of a down year in 2024, and some of that was definitely due to injury, Warren still hit a near 12% target share per game rate. He was at 15.3% the year prior. He's not giving us monster numbers, but he's capable of giving us serviceable ones at a price tag of RB37. I have him at RB33. This is one of those scenarios where I'm willing to give something small just to see how the team ends up managing their backfield in March and April. Because there's a chance that Jaylen Warren ends up being a winner through those 2 months. Because again, Najee Harris is a free agent. And maybe the Steelers don't spend that much draft capital on a running back in this year's draft. And the nice part with that is that if the Steelers do go that route in the draft, we at least know that Warren is a capable pass catcher who's probably going to be used in the tandem. So his value likely won't get dramatically lower unless Pittsburgh repeats their mistakes and gets another running back in round 1. That just doesn't seem very likely right now. I'm kind of surprised that Jonnu Smith isn't getting more love in the dynasty world right now. I think people might just be assuming that what he did in 2024 was a complete fluke. That during the second half of the season, when he was getting more love than any other pass catcher in that Miami offense, that was something that was like out of necessity or something. But on Keep Trade Cut, he's the tight end 16. He's behind Jake Ferguson and Pat Freiermuth for reference. I think that you could argue Jonnu Smith in the top 12 or so. Smith definitely benefited from a lower ADOT role in that Dolphins offense this past year. His average at the target was just 5 yards. Among the tight ends with 100 or more targets since 2011, that ADOT ranks in the 4th percentile. It was by no means normal. Now, I think that we'll see some regression from that number. It's similar to what we had with Evan Ingram in 2023. Ingram's target share, his total targets, they were a little bit higher than Jonnu's in 2024. But his targets per route run was nearly identical. His ADOT was also 5 yards. Ingram's had seasons more in that 5.5 to 6.5 ADOT range outside of that year. That's what we should probably expect from Jonnu Smith in this Miami offense, maybe in 2025. The difference, though, between him and Evan Ingram is that Smith is honestly more efficient per route run. Like, say what you want about his season being manufactured. He got it done. His yards per route run was higher than both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle's at 1.95. He's now had 3 seasons in his career with at least 100 routes run and a yards per route run rate of 1.8 or higher. There are only 14 tight ends since 2011 who have been able to do that. And nearly all of them were incredibly relevant in fantasy football. This past year was the only season where Jonnu Smith was a big fantasy contributor. And people are usually more inclined to sell those seasons than buy them. But I really think that Jonnu Smith has just been an undervalued player in football for some time. Now, we have the benefit of hindsight to say that, sure, but it's true. He deserved to steal work from Kyle Pitts. And while he didn't do a lot in New England during his 2 years there, his per route run numbers were always really, really strong, especially within context. So my thoughts with Jonnu Smith are simply this. What if Miami runs a similar offense in 2025? We can still see more looks go to Jalen Waddle, and Waddle have a better season in 2025 with Jonnu Smith paying off and being worthwhile in fantasy. Both of those things can happen. And yeah, Jonnu is going to be 30 years old next year. But where he's being drafted, where he's being ranked, you're really only looking for short-term production anyway. That's if you're truly getting him at that tight end 16 price tag. Now, I'm not necessarily higher or lower than the market with Jalen Coker, but I did want to call him out on today's show because this is the kind of player that fantasy managers tend to ignore. He's an undrafted guy from a small school, and trust me, the ZAP model, my process, it's going to ding that kind of player. His low prospect score is hurting his year 2 score. So that year 2 score isn't anything overly special. But in that year 2 model, I have what I call journey comparables. You guys can read all about this in the prospect guide. Those journey comparables, they look at players in history who sort of match the same journey as the player that we're analyzing, from ZAP score to year 2 score. Jalen Coker's top journey comparable is Jacoby Myers. And funny enough, Matt Harmon, who charts these guys with reception perception, he's made the exact same film-based comp. Which, by the way, bonus buy candidate, Jacoby Myers is always underrated in Dynasty. Anyway, Coker finished 2024 with a yards per route run rate of 1.72. That was significantly better than Xavier Legette's 1.19 rate in the exact same offense. The two guys play vastly different positions, but it just goes to show how strong Coker's season was, or maybe how bad Xavier Legette's was. But when we're talking about wide receivers in the wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6, wide receiver 7 range, if there's an obvious path for that player to go in, I'm willing to buy that path. A Jacoby Myers-like slot direction for Coker makes plenty of sense. And then as he develops, he can be more of that inside-out guy. He's not a screaming buy for me, but a lot of people sleep on this kind of player because he's not a household name. Now, because of this incoming running back draft class, I'd be pretty hesitant to be aggressive with higher-end running backs because they're more costly. There's more risk. So within this portion of the podcast, I'm going to throw 2 cheap running backs your way that you might want to have at the end of your roster just to see what happens. One of them's Ray Davis. Maybe he's not at the end of your roster, but he's definitely on the bench. Chances are with James Cook, the Bills won't be spending significant draft capital on a running back in this year's draft. And I don't know why they wouldn't like Ray Davis. I mentioned on last week's mailbag episode, but Davis is a decent year 2 model score compared to the rest of the running backs in last year's draft class. And at least compared to perception. It's actually the 3rd best in the class, behind Bucky Irving and Tyrone Tracy. And because the Bills are a team who probably won't be aggressive at running back in the draft, Ray Davis's role is probably pretty safe. And he'll be a year 2 guy, albeit an older year 2 guy, who has a shot to carve out a more substantial role. Don't forget, for as good as James Cook was this past year, he still only saw a 60% running back rush share per game rate. At a minimum, Ray Davis is a handcuff in a high-powered offense. Now, the other guy to throw a dart at, even more of a dart, is Roschon Johnson. This is just an off chance that Chicago doesn't want to add that much to that backfield, all while getting Ben Johnson and hopefully upgrading the offense in general. We saw what he did to the run game in Detroit, and the hope is obviously him bringing those same creative and deep dynamics to Chicago. Eric Bieniemy was just hired as the running backs coach too. But Roschon complements DeAndre Swift fairly well, and he can play all 3 downs. He's not David Montgomery. I'm not saying that Roschon Johnson can just be David Montgomery. No one should sell him that way. But there's a non-zero chance for him to play that kind of role in the Ben Johnson backfield. Now, I'm not expecting either player to really hit. I'm just playing probability here. But since they're both dart throws, they seem to fit well together in a general shout out today. Okay, so I recorded this episode on Monday, and then on Monday night, Cooper Kupp posted a tweet that said the following. I was informed that the team will be seeking a trade immediately and will be working with me and my family to find the right place to continue competing for championships. I don't agree with the decision and always believed it was going to begin and end in LA. Now, I won't spoil things, but that just makes this final buy candidate that much more interesting. Okay, let's get back to it. I'm going to close the show with one more dart throw type player. To me, this is where things are fun in Dynasty. We're going to get these guys wrong a ton, but when you hit, there is nothing better. There's a lot of chatter that Cooper Kupp's time in LA could be over. We saw a huge decline from him during the final stretch of the season and into the playoffs. And the Rams have an out with his contract here in 2025. It's been reported that Kupp wants to play, but he's unsure if it's going to be for the Rams. Now, obviously, that's good for Puka Nacua. But Nacua was going to get volume and production regardless. The dude's a stud. The player who has a chance, and I stress the phrase, a chance here, is Jordan Whittington. Whittington didn't look terrible, all things considered, in the ZAP model. He brought a lot of versatility to the table as sort of a hybrid player to start his collegiate career. And then he was a full-blown wide receiver by the end of it. But he had a pretty underrated rookie season for the Rams. He didn't get as much playing time as we wanted when Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp were out. But are you guys aware that he saw a target on 24% of his routes run, and he had a 2.50 yards per route run rate? For context, among rookie wide receivers with 100 or more routes since 2011, only Puka Nacua, Rashid Shaheed, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Odell Beckham, and Martavis Bryant got to that high of a yards per route run rate. But yeah, obviously not running a ton of routes, a few plays can impact that number. But the interesting thing with Whittington is that the other lower volume players on these lists were almost all deep threats. They had higher ADOTs. For instance, let's look at the wideouts who had a yards per route run rate as rookies above 2.2, so lower than Whittington's. But instead of just a minimum 100 routes run, let's look at 100 to 200 routes run. So we're not going to look at Puka Nacua or Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson. We're looking at lower volume players. That gives us Whittington, Shaheed, Martavis Bryant, and then Donovan Peoples-Jones and Jarius Wright. Well, all of those non-Whittington wide receivers had ADOTs above 10.4 yards. Whittington's was at 5.5. He may have benefited from some manufactured plays in that McVay offense, as do other wideouts in that offense. But he had to do something with those touches to raise that yards per route run rate. The closest routes run, ADOT, and yards per route run comp to Whittington is honestly Randall Cobb. Kadarius Toney is a close second. But both of those guys were looked at a whole lot more favorably after year one than Jordan Whittington is. And it's because both of them were looked at more favorably as prospects. But since when does Sean McVay care if his skill players are first-round picks? Look at Puka Nacua and Kyron Williams. If a dude can play, he can play. And with there being a potential opening in that offense, specifically in the slot where I think Whittington can thrive, to me, he's the perfect trade throw-in. It could amount to absolutely nothing, but there's enough logic behind this to really go for it. But yeah, that's the list today. I had some others that I thought about talking about, like Deontay Johnson, Noah Gray, even Brian Thomas, who I think will be undervalued by some managers. But the guys that I talked about were the ones that I felt most strongly about. And that's what you guys deserve to hear. Next week, we'll look at some sell candidates. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Remember, you can pre-order that prospect guide right now over on the site, lateround.com. Otherwise, I've got a Late Round Perspectives episode hitting your feeds on Friday with a great guest. I'll talk to you then.